Um, Reading Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley. It's the Barnes& and Noble Classics edition. The last couple of streams we read the some background on Mary Shelley and her life, um, giving some context for the time in which she wrote this story. Then we read the introduction that she wrote for the 1831 edition, in which she talks um, about how she got the idea, the inspiration for the story, the famous competition that she and her husband and Lord Byron and others had at, um, and and we also read the opening section, the letters that the character of Robert Walton, um, the letters that he wrote to his sister about how he met Frankenstein and even caught a glimpse of Frankenstein's monster up in the Arctic. And we ended with Frankenstein about to tell Robert Walton about his story, about the story of how he created the monster, of how he came to be, you know, so close to death in the Arctic, trying to hunt the monster down. And now we are at chapter 1, officially, chapter 1 of the book. I won't be reading much of it aloud, but I will, read some parts aloud and, provide a little bit of commentary. That's how I do these readings. So don't expect me to just read all the way through. I'm not. I get a scratchy throat, and I'm not very good at talking aloud. Okay, so let's get into it. Frankenstein, chapter 1. Mary, Mary really goes into the family history of Frankenstein himself in this. The story actually starts off with Frankenstein talking about how his father um, came to be married. He says that his family is one of the most distinguished in the area where he was born. Can't help thinking that that's a little bit of a commentary on Mary's own life. See, as we covered in the previous video, her father, William Godwin, was a pretty respectable man, but just like Frankenstein will no doubt come to bring shame on his family, Mary probably brought more than a little shame on her own family when she ran off with Percy Shelley, who was a married man at the time. On the other hand, maybe this family history that's in here will actually be important to the story. I'm reminded of reading all this background about Frankenstein's parents. I'm reminded of all the times I've been on Twitter and somebody's asked me, or somebody's just asked in general, not me specifically, but another writer would ask the writers of Twitter, how do you pick names for your characters? And I would always say something like, well, I would pick whatever name their parents would have named them. I mean, are their parents sports nuts? Are their parents fans of the theater, of classic literature? Are they religious parents? That's how they would pick a name. My own parents named me Stephen because of Stephen in the Bible. So so I would always tell them, you have to know what this person's parents are like to know what they would name their son or their daughter or whoever. Mary Shelley definitely knew what type of parents Frankenstein's people were, what kind of people Frankenstein's parents were. Excuse me. She knew what kind of people they were. There's a lot of details about their lives and about how they came to know each other, about how they came to be married. It's it's really interesting. I get the feeling that even if this weren't a story about Frankenstein, its monster, that it would still be a very interesting story. I get the feeling that Mary Shelley would have been a really exceptional writer if that's what she had wanted to be. I also get the feeling that she didn't very much want to be a writer, but she is very talented. we talk. You know, now we get to Frankenstein being born, and he talks about how his parents were traveling all over the continent, Europe at the time, and about how he was their only child for a long time, and that he says, I was their plaything and their idol and something better, their child, the innocent and helpless creature bestowed on them by heaven, whom to bring up to good, and whose future lot it was in their hands to direct to happiness or misery according as they fulfilled their duties toward me. With this deep consciousness of what they owed towards the being to which they had given life, added to the active spirit of tenderness that animated both, it may be imagined that while during every hour of my infant life I received a lesson of patience, of charity, and of self-control, I was so guided by a silken cord that all seemed but one train of enjoyment to me. Very much getting into the basis of all these characters' relationships with each other. It's I don't think it's something a lot of writers would recommend these days, simply because, you want them to get on with the story. But Mary understands that the characters are the story. She really gets into it. I really, I really like that. I really appreciate that. It says that during their travels, Frankenstein's mother uh, meets a poor peasant family in Italy, and and finds out that they have a lot of children, and they also have a foster child who is left with them as an orphan that they can't take care of. So, so because his mother had always wanted a daughter as well, she offered to take the young girl with her. And now Frankenstein has a foster sister, Elizabeth. Everyone loved Elizabeth. The passionate and almost reverential attachment with which all regarded her became, while I shared it, my pride and my delight. On the evening previous to her being brought to my home, my mother had said playfully, "I have a pretty present for my Victor. Tomorrow he shall have it." And when on the morrow she presented Elizabeth to me as her promised gift, I, with childish seriousness, interpreted her words literally, and looked upon Elizabeth as mine to protect, love, and cherish. All praises bestowed on her I received as made to a possession of mine own. We called each other familiarly by the name of cousin. No word, no expression could body forth the kind of relation in which she stood to me, my more than sister, since till death she was to be mine only. I mean, wow. I think originally Elizabeth was supposed to have actually been his sister in the story. But that was revised for a later edition because that would have just made what we read now just that much creepier. Still, it's a little creepy, even for a 5-year-old to be. But it gives us a little bit more insight into their dynamic, of course, and that's what Mary always seems to be about in these books, is about the characters' dynamics with each other. And like I said, she does a very good job of it. Chapter 2. We were brought up together. There was not quite a year difference in our ages. I need not say that we were strangers to any species of disunion or dispute. Harmony was the soul of our companionship, and the diversity and contrast that subsisted in our characters drew us nearer together. Elizabeth was of a calmer and more concentrated disposition, but with all my ardor, I was capable of a more intense application, and was more deeply smitten with the thirst for knowledge. Going more obviously into their characters, and and even as she brings Elizabeth more into focus, it's with the purpose of telling us more about Frankenstein himself. Everything that, I mean, there's more than Frankenstein to the story, of course, but everything we're hearing about Elizabeth is in relation to Frankenstein. Even how other people see Elizabeth is described as how it affects Frankenstein's own perceptions. While my companion contemplated with a serious and satisfied spirit the magnificent appearances of things, I delighted in investigating their causes. The world was to me a secret, which I desired to divine. Curiosity, earnest research to learn the hidden laws of nature, gladness akin to rapture as they were unfolded to me, are among the earliest sensations I can remember. He's a scientist, even at a very young age. He wants to uncover the secrets of God. He goes on to talk about how his parents finally had another child when he was 7 years old. They had a second son, and talks about them moving to a lake house. It was my temper to avoid a crowd and to attach myself fervently to a few. I was indifferent, therefore, to my schoolfellows in general, but I united myself in the bonds of the closest friendship to one among them, Henry Clerval. So now we're being introduced not only to his younger brother, but to his one school friend. He says that his frame of mind was turned not towards childish pursuits, but to an eager desire to learn, and not to learn all things indiscriminately. I confess that neither the structure of languages, nor the code of governments, nor the politics of various states possessed attractions for me. It was the secrets of heaven and earth that I desired to learn. I'm starting to get the feeling that Frankenstein might have been autistic. He doesn't, he tends to, he tends to take things literally, like when his mother says that his new foster sister is a gift to him, that he takes that literally. he talks about how he doesn't like crowds, but he did have just the one friend. He talks about how he's not interested in learning everything. He's very hyper focused on the things that he does want to learn. He's very different. You can tell that. I mean, this is obviously originally written in the very early 1800s. They didn't even have a word for autistics at the time. But there were, of course, autistic people, and Mary would likely have known some in her life. Perhaps she was even autistic herself. Who knows? He talks about how his devotion to his studies might have made him a harder person if it weren't for uh, the lovely Elizabeth and his friend Henry Clerville being there to soften his nature. I feel exquisite pleasure in dwelling on the recollections of childhood before misfortune had tainted my mind and changed its bright visions of extensive usefulness into gloomy and narrow reflections upon self. Remember, this is written as if it's Frankenstein at the end of his life, looking back and talking about everything that's going on in his life. And it's interesting. We get that little reminder of what a hollow and shriveled person he had become at the end. He's warning us that he used to be a much more optimistic person. In drawing the picture of my early days, I also record those events which led, by insensible steps, to my after tale of misery. For when I would account to myself for the birth of that passion which afterwards ruled my destiny, I find it arise, like a mountain river, from ignoble and almost forgotten sources. But, swelling as it proceeded, it became the torrent which, in its course, has swept away all my hopes and joys. His curiosity was his downfall, like the cat. I'm starting to think that that might be the only reason a story like this could get published back then. Frankenstein is often considered the first science fiction novel. And while we didn't have things like the Hays Code or anything back then, you had you had plenty of moral guardians. So a story about a man creating life, I'm pretty sure they would only have published it if it became clear that it was absolutely the wrong thing to do. He talks about how when he was 13, he happened to find a volume of the works of Cornelius Agrippa. There's a note here about it. Let's see if we can get an idea on who Cornelius Agrippa was. A German physician wrote several books, including A Defense of Magic in 1531. His mystical philosophies drew on Neoplatonic, Kabbalistic, and Christian traditions. He was persecuted during his lifetime for his occult beliefs. My father looked carelessly at the title page of my book and said, "Ah, Cornelius Agrippa. My dear Victor, do not waste your time upon this. It is sad trash." Even without reading anything more than that, I can just see the wheels turning in Frankenstein's mind. You told me not to read it? That makes me want to read it even more. Yep, here we go. If instead of this remark, my father had taken the pains to explain to me that the principles of Agrippa had been entirely exploded and that a modern system of science had been introduced, which possessed much greater powers than the ancient, because the powers of the latter were chimerical, while those of the former were real and practical. Under such circumstances, I should certainly have thrown Agrippa aside, and have contented my imagination, warmed as it was, by returning with greater ardor to my former studies. So Frankenstein has reached his rebellious teenager phase. But the cursory glance my father had taken of my volume by no means assured me that he was acquainted with its contents, and I continued to read with the greatest avidity. And he talks about Paracelsus and Albertus Magnus. Paracelsus, I'm probably saying that wrong, was a Swiss alchemist and physician who firmly claimed that it is possible to create human life and gave instructions on how to do it. Albertus Magnus was a German scholar, Dominican monk, and the teacher of Thomas Aquinas. He was made a saint by the Roman Catholic Church in 1931, even though he lived in the 1200s. Hmm. Yeah. Yep. Uh, his father's offhand comment sends Victor Frankenstein on a ride down the alchemy route, down the let's create life on our own route. He's got some grand ideas here from reading all these books. He says he wants to banish disease from the human frame and render man invulnerable to any but a violent death. Nor were these my only visions. The raising of ghosts or devils was a promise liberally accorded by my favorite authors, the fulfillment of which I most eagerly sought. And if my incantations were always unsuccessful, I attributed the failure rather to my own inexperience and mistake than to a want of skill or fidelity in my instructors. And thus for a time I was occupied by exploded systems, mingling, like an unadept, 1,000 contradictory theories, and floundering desperately in a very slough of multifarious knowledge, guided by an ardent imagination and childish reasoning, till an accident again changed the current of my ideas. When I was about 15 years old, we had retired to our house near Belrive, when we witnessed a most violent and terrible thunderstorm. It advanced from behind the mountains of Jura, and the thunder burst at once with frightful loudness from various quarters of the heavens. I remained, while the storm lasted, watching its progress with curiosity and delight. As I stood at the door, on a sudden I beheld a stream of fire issue from an old and beautiful oak, which stood about 20 yards from our house. And so soon as the dazzling light vanished, the oak had disappeared, and nothing remains but a blasted stump. When we visited it the next morning, we found the tree shattered in a singular manner. It was not splintered by the shock, but entirely reduced to thin ribbons of wood. I never beheld anything so utterly destroyed. Before this, I was not unacquainted with the more obvious laws of electricity. On this occasion, a man of great research in natural philosophy was with us, and, excited by this catastrophe, he entered on the explanation of a theory which he had formed on the subject of electricity and galvanism, which was at once new and astonishing to me. All that he said threw greatly into the shade Cornelius Agrippa, Albertus Magnus, and Paracelsus, the lords of my imagination. But by some fatality, the overthrow of these men disinclined me to pursue my accustomed studies. It seemed to me as if nothing would or could ever be known. All that had so long engaged my attention suddenly grew despicable. By one of those caprices of the mind which we are perhaps most subject to in early youth, I at once gave up my former occupations, set down natural history and all its progeny as a deformed and abortive creation, and entertained the greatest disdain for a would-be science, which could never even step within the threshold of real knowledge. In this mood of mind I betook myself to the mathematics, and the branches of study appertaining to that science, as being built upon secure foundations, and so worthy of my consideration. Thus strangely are our souls constructed, and by such slight ligaments are we bound to prosperity or ruin. When I look back, it seems to me as if this almost miraculous change of inclination and will was the immediate suggestion of the guardian angel of my life, the last effort made by the spirit of preservation to avert the storm that was even then hanging in the stars and ready to envelop me. Her victory was announced by an unusual tranquillity and gladness of soul, which followed the relinquishing of my ancient and latterly tormenting studies. It was thus that I was to be taught to associate evil with their prosecution, happiness with their disregard. It was a strong effort of the spirit of good, but it was ineffectual. Destiny was too potent, and her immutable laws had decreed my utter and terrible destruction. You can't change the course of a river. You can only make ripples. That's the end of chapter 2. I think that's enough for tonight. Thank you for watching. I'll talk to you more later.